The Data Collectors. Written by Danielle Palli. Narrated by Graham Mack and Danielle Palli. 10. Class. 4 years ago. 1 year after the assembly.
I would like you to take a deep inhale through your nose, feel the air as it moves to the back of your throat and then down into your belly to about 2 inches below your navel.
The meditation instructor said, in a flowing, melodic voice.
Pause your breath and then exhale slowly.
The instructor sat tall, her neck long and back straight. She wore a pair of brightly coloured palazzo pants and a short-sleeved yellow tunic, accentuating her dark skin and elegant white hair wrapped in box braids. If you looked closely, you would notice a serene smile on her face. Fatima shifted uncomfortably on her meditation bolster and squeezed her eyes tightly together, taking uneven breaths. It was all Fatima's idea. She was convinced that Lucene was bottling up unwanted emotions and was certain that trying a meditation class would help slough all that stuff out. It was her turn to pick a class. In an effort to expand their horizons, also at Fatima's suggestion, the two friends embarked on a monthly ritual of trying something new for the month and then seeing what would stick. They had already attempted sailing lessons, stand-up paddleboarding, bocce ball on the beach, and lute-making classes. So far, bocce ball was winning. Lucene sank into meditation easily somehow. All of this felt familiar. She could hear the instructor's voice in the distance as she continued.
For this meditation, we are seeking to explore a situation from the past that may be preventing us from moving into the future.
It was a small class, only 9 people in attendance. They were meeting in a small temple that turned out to be a short distance from Fatima's cottage. The class led by the church's priestess, Reverend Isabella. One man started to drift off to sleep, but caught himself as he began to slump forward. He snorted slightly, looking around to make sure no one had noticed, and resumed his practice. Another woman sat with clenched fists, slowly releasing them as the meditation continued.
You're walking down a long hallway. At the end of it is a door. Walk slowly toward it.
Lucene felt uneasy, but made her way toward the door. It was a Rembrandt-style rustic red-arched door.
Behind that door is a past dresser we will work with today.
The instructor reminded everyone to approach whatever arose from the perspective of an outside observer. Lucene's face became flushed.
Put your hand on the knob or handle and slowly open it.
The door swung open, and Lucene let out a scream.
Oh my gosh, what happened?
Fatima tried to rush to her friend's aid, only to realize that her right leg had fallen asleep and she couldn't stand up. She pounded on her leg and winced through the feeling of pins and needles. There was a murmur from the class as Isabella knelt down beside Lucene and took her by the shoulders, rubbing them gently to bring her back to the present.
It's okay, you're safe,
she told her. Lucene nodded, embarrassed. Isabella called for a 5-minute break. The class stood, stretched and moved around the room, whispering with occasional glances in Lucene's direction. Lucene stood, doing a forward bend and wrapping her arms around the back of her legs to stretch, then rolled up to a standing position and rotated her head from side to side to loosen up her neck.
I'm okay now, but I think I'll step outside for a moment,
she told the teacher with a confidence she didn't really feel. Isabella nodded, slowly understanding, but said nothing.
I'm fine,
Lucene reiterated, even though she hadn't been asked a question. She stepped out into the parking lot. The sun shone brightly on her face.
Wait up,
Fatima called, limping slightly after her friend.
What the heck happened back there?
Lucene wasn't entirely sure herself.
I don't know. I just got to the door and it was red. Red?
Fatima interrupted.
Couldn't you imagine a green door or a blue door? I couldn't help it. It wanted to be red. Anyway, I opened it and suddenly I was flooded with images and sounds and emotions and so much emotion. I just couldn't take it.
Lucene began trembling. Fatima wrapped her arms around her friend in a sideways bear hug, pinning the top of her arms to her side.
I could feel all the pain and joy in the world at the same time. It was just too much,
she explained, feebly attempting to hug her friend back, but managing only to tap Fatima's forearms with her free hands.
Sorry to embarrass you.
Fatima let out a giggle that made her entire body quiver like a jello jiggler.
Oh my gosh,
she laughed.
As if that were possible. Don't worry, my friend.
She released her bear hug and looked Lucene in the eyes.
I have no shame.
Lucene wiped a tear from her cheek.
Excuse me.
Isabella approached her, palazzo pants swaying gently in the breeze.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I feel compelled to speak with you.
Lucene and Fatima stepped back to allow her to join their circle.
As you know, I'm priestess of the sanctuary.
Lucene and Fatima introduced themselves in return, waiting for the pitch inviting them to become members of her church. They both hated being recruited, as neither of them considered themselves to be particularly religious. She handed Lucene her card.
I am in need of an assistant to help me manage the sanctuary. If you are seeking a job, please contact me or just stop in. The door is always open for you. You don't even know me and you're offering me a job?
Lucene was surprised, partially because she had just made quite the spectacle of herself, even more so because she happened to be in need of some type of income.
Anyone with that much empathy is clearly called for a higher purpose.
With that, she went back into the class.
We'll be continuing class in a moment, perhaps just a simple breathing meditation. I hope you will both join us. Sure,
Lucene answered.
We'll be right there. You sure? Yeah, as long as there are no red doors, I'll be fine. I was right about one thing.
Fatima bragged as she followed Lucene back inside.
Yeah, what's that? You sure have a lot of pent-up emotions to slough off.
11. Journey to Earth. 1 year ago. 4 years after the assembly. We will be entering the deep zone soon, Cepheus informed Tanager, who was in the fitness room, running, no, more like taking a brisk jog, on the moving belt. He loathed exercise, in spite of knowing its necessity for health, and was constantly measuring exactly how much of it he needed to be at peak performance without going above that ratio at all. Make yourself ready. Thanks, Tanager replied, working on his colloquialisms as much as possible before their visit to Earth. I'll suit up. He slowed his pace and stepped down, the belt crawling to a stop as soon as he did so. Do I have time to hit the showers? Cepheus paused for a moment and then nodded, yes. Within a short time, Tanager had changed and was strapping himself into a navigation chair beside Cepheus. The deep zone was an ocean-like pocket in space where extreme pressure could prove hazardous to both themselves and their vessel. To compensate, the vessel had collapsible external walls that were vented to add an extra layer of protection, while still letting interstellar gases pass through without harming the ship. As an added precaution, travellers wore more traditional suits, with built-in oxygen masks that were fastened into their seats. Fortunately, this was a small zone, which meant they would be able to resume normal flight functions within the hour. Are you nervous? Tanager asked his colleague. His voice sounded like a faraway broadcast as the sound travelled from the intercom in his suit to the headset in Cepheus's. Why should I be nervous? He sucked in a deep breath. About meeting Lucene. She'll be about 31. 32, Cepheus corrected. Yes, she'll be about 32 when we get there, and you haven't spoken with her in more than 25 years. That's not entirely true. You're forgetting the assembly. Ah, yes, Tanager remembered. She may not have remembered because of the lightning strike, but I know a part of her recognized me. The two travelled in silence for the next 10 minutes, each routinely running monitor checks to make certain that all the contractable sections of the ship remained intact. "But yes," Cepheus said. "What?" "I am nervous." They continued in silence for a few minutes more. "What about you?" "What about me?" Tanager asked. "Are you nervous?" "Why should I be nervous?" "Because we learned at an early age that you were both of the same vibration, and that it was very likely that you'd make a good pair." "Don't be nonsensical." "Silly." "What?" "I believe the word you were looking for was silly." "Don't be silly." "Exactly. Thanks you. I mean, thank you." Tanager pointed toward a clear window view of an approaching ringed planet. Cepheus nodded and smiled. "I have no reason to be nervous." Tanager finally answered. "Firstly, she's many years younger than I." "What does that matter?" "Nothing where we come from. I recognize that we typically live twice as long as earthlings, but it will matter to her." "Why should it?" "If you don't tell her your age, she'll never know." "Well, that would be misleading, wouldn't it?" "Perhaps so," Cepheus agreed. "Secondly, we're from two different planets. Two vastly different experiences." "That might change." "And thirdly," Tanager persisted, "and who is to say we'd even feel that way about one another?" "Same vibration," Cepheus pointed out. "All that means is that we're inclined to have similar interests and values. That doesn't mean anything. And fourthly—" "There's a fourthly?" Cepheus was surprised. Tanager nodded. "And fourthly, our biggest concern is getting her to safety. That needs to be our focus." "This is true," Cepheus acknowledged somberly. The two continued on their journey, taking a moment to admire the surplus of stars popping up as they neared the deep zone's end. A good half-hour passed before Tanager spoke again. "Yes?" "Yes, what?" Cepheus asked. "I've forgotten the question." "I am a little nervous." 12. The Gathering. Saturday evening, 5 years after the assembly. Fatima buzzed through the kitchen like a hummingbird, singing to herself. How she managed to move with such ease while wearing an ankle-length brown corset dress, high-heeled boots, and with a clock charm bracelet running up and down her arms, Lucene had no idea. If Lucene was not mistaken, the tune was Some Enchanted Evening. She watched as her friend swiftly diced up onions on the cutting board. Fatima's lavender hair pulled back on one side in a tight bun as she gazed softly at the board in front of her and smiled, not really seeing it. Lucene had witnessed this look many times before, and it could only mean one thing. Fatima was in love. Again.
"You seem extra cheerful today,"
Lucene commented, casually pushing the dining room chairs in so they lined up neatly around the table, all while doing a cursory check to make sure there was no evidence of last night's encounter. Fatima smiled softly and nodded, but did not reply.
"Anything I can do to help?"
Lucene offered, uncertainly, peering down at her rather loose-fitting teal maxi dress, wondering if she were over or underdressed. Having no sense of style, she really wasn't sure. The two did not entertain very often, and when they did, it was usually when Fatima's very large family descended on them unannounced. In those instances, Lucene had nothing to do but watch in wonder as both men and women coordinated a large-scale meal with minimal bickering as to whether the soup needed more garlic or the rice could use a pinch more saffron. Fatima thought for a moment.
"You could set the table. We need 5 places. Or maybe put on some music, something fun."
After a quick mental head count, Lucene came up with only 4 names. Fatima, Ivan, Tanager, and of course herself. She knew that Cepheus' appearance would inspire too many questions, and he would not be in attendance.
Fatima?
Lucene adopted that tone of voice.
Why do we need 5 places? Oh, because I met someone.
Fatima waved her hand as if the matter were of small consequence. She let out a twitter and, quite literally, jiggled up and down like a small child who just learned that she was going to Disney World.
Fatima, you didn't once again invite a total stranger into our home. I did, and he's wonderful, don't worry.
Grabbing Lucene's shoulders for emphasis, Lucene did worry. Still, she bit her tongue. She knew better than to try to reason with her friend. And yet she cringed every time Fatima met someone new, or rather, every time she fell in love, which was pretty much the same thing. She hated having these confrontations with Fatima. Voicing her opinion in the past would always result in an argument. It was the only time Fatima would lift her nose like a dog sniffing the air, reminding Lucene just who the house really belonged to. Still, her concern escalated. Fatima didn't typically invite them home until they had been around for a while, which didn't happen often. Perhaps it had been unwise of her to allow Tanager to give her a ride home. It sent the wrong message that it was okay to trust strangers.
So, about that music? Oh, right.
Lucene scurried to the living room and inspected their growing music collection. Fatima's music collection was mainly housed on a digital sound bar, about the size of a small brick, that sat inconspicuously behind a television, which was, admittedly, not much bigger. Beneath the TV lived a vintage portable DVD-CD player, amplifier, and a cabinet which held Lucene's outdated CD collection. She flipped through them haphazardly, as they were in no particular order, before settling on one with minimal scratches and adding it to their media player. Cole Porter's Begin the Begin filled the room.
Oh, I love this one. Can you turn it up?
She hummed along gently from the kitchen. The two friends may not have had much in common, but they both shared an eclectic taste in music, which included a particular fondness for songs ranging from the 1920s through the 1940s. Fatima preferred to stream her music online, but knowing Lucene's distrust for computers and advanced technology, she humoured her friend's insistence on playing only CDs, drawing the line at cassettes and vinyl records. The doorbell let out a bird-like tweet, signalling an arrival. Fatima quickly wiped her hands on her apron.
Here,
She said, with a wooden spoon over a large pot of homemade curry lentil soup.
stir.
She commanded. Lucene quickly obeyed, grabbing the spoon dutifully while Fatima answered the door. There stood Ivan and Tanager. Tanager was dressed in a double-breasted grey suit, button-down vest, and crisp white shirt that looked more in line with the time period of the music they were listening to than today's era. He carried with him a bottle of 15-year-old tawny port. Ivan, on the other hand, wore a black Earth Day T-shirt and the only pair of jeans he owned without holes in them. He polished the look off with penny loafers, placing flat washers where the pennies should have been. "We happened to arrive at the same time," Ivan explained awkwardly, after seeing the laser-eyed warning Lucene shot from her place at the stove. He understood enough to know that it was best to keep Cepheus hidden and pretend that he and Tanager hadn't met before this evening. It wasn't much of a stretch, as the gentlemen had really only known each other for the past 24 hours.
Well, since you two have already met, come on in. Nice to see you both again.
Fatima smiled graciously. Tanager offered up the port. "I wasn't sure what to bring," he apologized, "but I thought this might be a good digestive. The woman working at the store recommended it." Fatima accepted the gift, eyeing the bottle approvingly.
Perfect.
She whispered, and meant it wholeheartedly, Still smiling, she set it on the counter.
Please, make yourself comfortable.
Fatima relieved Lucene of the spoon at just the right time, as Lucene began stirring the pot so fast they would have been eating pureed lentil baby food in a few more minutes.
Yes, nice to see you again. Can I take your jacket for you?
Lucene jumped in. While Lucene helped Tanager with his suit jacket, Ivan followed Fatima to the kitchen, scratching nervously behind his ear. So, not exactly a dinner gift. I did bring something for you. Ivan reached into his back pocket and pulled out a tiny plastic case and popped it open. Inside was what looked like a phone memory chip. He held it up for her to see. Fatima politely moved in for a closer look.
I see,
she replied politely, but she didn't really see.
Thank you.
Oh, you don't even know what it is yet, 'cause I haven't told you. He smiled sheepishly. Well, more like a bearded goat, actually.
What is it?
Fatima asked. Having finished with the soup, she moved to the Spanish onion torts in the oven. She shooed Ivan away from the oven door, and he backed up to the refrigerator, still holding the tiny black disc between his meaty thumb and forefinger. Well, let's say your car was a homing pigeon.
Interesting,
Fatima offered, engrossed in removing the tort from the oven and testing for doneness.
Would you mind putting down a trivet for me?
She motioned an eye toward the still unset table. Ivan rushed to comply, putting the small device back in its case and tucking it into his pocket. Lucene wrapped Tanager's jacket around the back of one of the dining room chairs and then darted around Ivan in a quest for dinner plates. May I be of assistance? Tanager offered, helpfully.
Sure,
Lucene answered, pausing to look him in the eyes as if searching for information. She still needed to ask him what he knew about her parents, but had to find the right time.
No.
Fatima jumped in. Lucene took a step back, jarred from her thoughts.
You're our guest. You be comfortable. Ivan can help Lucene set the table for 5 of us.
Ivan tilted his head slightly, unsure whether to be offended at not being considered a guest or flattered that she was comfortable enough with him to put him to work. He decided the latter. After all, he did know where the silverware was kept, and had the table set for 5 in no time. He had just begun to wonder who the 5th place setting was for, when the doorbell rang.
Salad,
Fatima exclaimed as she ran for the door. Both men looked like confused puppies. But to Lucene, it was perfectly clear. When Fatima cooked, she went into militant mode.
Excuse me.
Lucene nudged Ivan out of the way. As expected, an Asian kale salad with peanut dressing sat inside the refrigerator, waiting for its debut. Lucene grabbed the covered glass bowl, quickly setting it on the table before rummaging for tongs in the utensil drawer. According to her best estimation, dinner would be in exactly 5 to 7 minutes. Just enough time to greet the final guest, make sure everyone had a beverage, and then serve the tort, soup, and salad together. Not one to believe in serving courses, as that just complicated things. Fatima preferred to set the feast out all at once. Ivan had learned the hard way that it was best to start with the hot foods while they were still hot, then move on to what was already cold, lest he receive an icy stare from the chef. My lovely Fatima. Roman stood in the doorway, dressed in a button-down black poplin shirt with white buttons and a pair of black jeans and matching shoes. His wavy black hair was tied back. Fatima's smile matched Roman's, and then some, revealing 2 deep-set dimples and blushing cheeks. Her gaze fell on the carnations in his hand. They were frosted purple. These are for you, he offered. They match the highlights in your hair. Who's that? Ivan asked Lucene, with visible uncertainty from the kitchen.
Not sure. She only just met him.
Lucene answered honestly. I don't like him, Ivan decided. There's something about him that rubs me the wrong way. Rubs you how? Tanager was confused. It's an expression, Ivan and Lucene answered in unison. Fatima seemed to have momentarily forgotten all about dinner, and everyone else in the room for that matter.
Thank you,
she answered, attempting to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, nervously, only to remember that it was rolled up in a bun.
They're beautiful. Please come in.
Fatima stepped inside.
Roman, this is my friend and roommate Lucene.
Lucene offered a hand politely. Roman outstretched a pale, thin hand and took it hesitantly.
Nice to meet you,
she said. Any friend of Fatima's is no doubt a friend of mine, he gushed, kissing Lucene's hand in a grand gesture. Fatima blushed once more. Lucene smiled politely, then retreated to the kitchen sink to wash her hands.
This is my neighbor Ivan,
Fatima continued, ignoring Lucene's departure. Ivan scowled momentarily before conceding to offer his hand. Aye, he added, and long-term friend and Praetorian. Don't kiss me hand, he advised. Roman shook it, cautiously. Ivan noted the softness of Roman's palms and handshake, adding it to his mental list of why he did not trust him. Fatima did not seem to notice.
And this is Lucene's friend Tanager from...
Out of town, he offered. I am pleased to make your acquaintance. Tanager followed suit by presenting an outstretched hand in friendship. Relieved, Roman shook it, without incident.
Drinks.
Fatima launched back into military mode and softly added,
Well, I just go put these in some water. Please, have a seat while I get the wine and water,
Lucene suggested. As she expected, Tanager insisted on helping, and was tasked with setting out 5 water glasses and filling them with cooled lemon water from the refrigerator, while Lucene opened a Rioja Reserve that Fatima had settled on just for this evening. I'll get the wine glasses, Ivan declared, before adding, as he glanced toward Roman, since I know where they are. Lucene was only 2 minutes off, as dinner was served exactly 9 minutes after the arrival of the last guest. It was mostly uneventful, with a few praises to the chef and compliments on the wine. Lucene sat at one end of the table, Roman at the other, with Tanager seated to her right, Ivan to her left, and Fatima sandwiched between her 2 admirers, across from Tanager. So how is it that you two met? Roman inquired, eyeing Lucene and Tanager back and forth.
Tanager rescued me from the grocery store after my car broke down in the rain,
Lucene answered simply. The Fates are amazing women, aren't they? Roman remarked, shooting an admiring glance at Fatima. And how long ago was that? Tanager retrieved his pocket watch. About 29 hours ago, he answered, snapping it closed and placing it back in his pocket. Really? Roman was taken aback. I would have guessed that you'd known each other for years. Interesting. And how did you meet? Ivan rested his elbow on the table, motioning toward Fatima before she nudged him to remove the offending elbow. I was at the bar at the restaurant where Fatima works. He paused to take a forkful of the tort before continuing. I wasn't having any fun at all until I tried the most exquisite ahi tuna made by this lovely lady. Ivan sat back and shot Fatima a self-explanatory look. Really? And the glance said, At the bar where you work?
The Fates?
Fatima shrugged her shoulder and sipped her soup. And what brought you to the crab shack that fateful evening? Ivan inquired. Searching for a soulmate, were you? Not at all, Roman answered, turning his gaze back to Fatima and clasping her hand gently at the table. Fatima did not chastise him for putting his elbow on the table, and shyly clasped his hand in return. It just worked out that way. Ivan swallowed a bit of salad with some difficulty. Lucene was beginning to share Ivan's sentiment, but not out of jealousy. It was due more to his over-the-top overtures to someone he met just the evening prior. It was as if he were a child in a man's body, experiencing puppy love for the first time. Tanager sipped his wine in silence, observing with as little judgment as possible. If you must know, Roman continued, as if relenting to divulge private information under duress. "I was there for my research." "Research?" Tanager's eyes perked up, intrigued. "Yes," Roman continued. "While I can't go into detail at this juncture, I can tell you that I am an anthropology professor, currently conducting research for a white paper I'm writing on relationships in the modern era."
How fascinating.
Fatima all but batted her eyes at Roman.
Let us know how we can help with that research.
She fawned, realizing that her statement may have been interpreted more seductively than she had intended. Her cheeks returned to a flushed crimson. Ivan's also flared red, but for a very different reason. At that moment, "It's Time to Say Goodnight" began playing from the soundbar. It was unclear whether Tanager found it to be the perfect diversion in order to diffuse a potentially volatile situation, or whether he simply liked dancing. Whichever the case, he quickly turned to Fatima and asked, "As the host of this evening, would you honor me with the first dance?"
Well, sir, I would be delighted,
she answered, brushing her napkin to the side. Fatima took the hand he offered and accompanied him to the living room, where he began waltzing in the small open area in front of the couch. Fatima, among her other talents, was an enormously good dancer, and followed easily as Tanager led her around the floor. "Can I ask you a question?" he whispered, leaning in.
Sure, ask me anything.
"I couldn't help but notice that Lucene seems to have an aversion to doors. Any idea why?"
Oh, only red doors.
Fatima answered matter-of-factly.
That's why she goes through the window and avoids the front door.
She motioned towards the kitchen. "I see. Actually, no, I don't see. Why red doors?"
She won't tell me. I've offered to paint the front door dark blue, but she would have none of it.
"Why not?"
Because she said she'd always know it was a red door posing as a blue door.
Tanager simply nodded, as if this logic made perfect sense, and the two continued their dance.
There's more,
Fatima whispered.
She doesn't like computers or things with computers in them.
"Really?" Tanager was curious. "Did she say why?"
I don't know.
Fatima shook her head.
But I suspect she thinks someone's trying to follow her. She's been weird like that since she moved in with me 5 years ago. I try not to pry.
Tanager's expression changed, as if a light bulb just went off in his head. He pushed the thought away and replaced his look of surprise with a warm smile. Fatima smiled in return. Roman admired Fatima from the kitchen, resting his chin in his hand on the table, with a half-upturned smile plastered across his face. "I wonder what they're talking about," he mused. "Me, I hope." It was only then that he noticed Lucene awkwardly pushing a stray piece of kale around her plate. Lucene, would you care to dance?"
I would, except I really don't know how to do that.
She motioned toward Fatima and Tanager, who were floating around the room like Fred and Ginger. "Not to worry," Roman answered. "I have a solution. Follow me." Lucene reluctantly followed Roman to the makeshift dance floor, while Ivan decided it might be a good time to pop open the port. "Now," Roman instructed, circling an arm around her waist, "step on my toes."
Excuse me?
Lucene gave Roman a sideways glance. A good deal taller than Lucene, she ended up peering at his nostrils. "Step on my toes," he tried again. "Then you don't have to worry about a misstep." "Don't worry," he assured. "I don't mind." Lucene stepped carefully on his feet. He winced.
Sorry.
She moved away. "No, it's fine." Lucene wasn't so sure it was fine. He awkwardly lifted one weighted foot at a time as they hobbled in a misshapen square pattern. From the kitchen, Ivan noticed a carpet bag sitting at the end of the long countertop, the one Fatima carried with her everywhere. He glanced at the two couples on the dance floor, but each seemed preoccupied. He once again removed the tiny case from his pocket and reached into Fatima's bag, poking around until he found what he was looking for. Moments later the song ended, and another began. Moonlight in Vermont. Fatima smiled as she crossed paths with the other couple, stopping abruptly.
Lucene, let me show you how it's done. May I cut in?
Lucene gratefully stepped down from Roman's toes and allowed her friend to cut in. Roman circled his arms around her thick waist, and the two moved with surprising ease. His lean frame stood more than a foot above her. As far as couples go, many tend to resemble each other. But these two were like watching a plantain and an acorn squash dance. "May I teach you?" Tanager spoke softly over Lucene's shoulder. She shivered.
Well, you can try, but I've got no rhythm.
Lucene laughed awkwardly as she turned to face him. "I don't believe that's true," Tanager answered, thoughtfully. She expected verbal instruction, but instead he simply began stepping and she followed. It was as if there were a magnet between them, and she naturally followed where he led. Before she knew it, she too was moving with ease around the room. They kept dancing long after the music stopped. Lucene glanced up to see Roman, Fatima, and Ivan off to the side of the room, watching the two in earnest.
Well, 1, I didn't know you could dance. Lucene, you've been holding down on me. And 2, you both realize this isn't the 18th century and you're actually allowed to hold hands when you dance.
It was only then that Lucene realized that Tanager had not actually had his arm around her waist, nor did he have their arms up in a traditional couple's dance. But the energy between them was so strong that she was sure they had been touching. Tanager searched Lucene's face for some sign of recognition, but found none. Instead, she pulled away and headed back to the kitchen. She glanced down at her arms, noticing that the branch-like lightning patterns had a glow about them. Lucene quickly crossed her arms awkwardly in front of her.
How about pouring some of that port, Ivan?
Roman arrived home with an ear-to-ear grin that he couldn't shake. It wasn't often that one found the woman of their dreams, and yet he had. Nothing could spoil this moment. He stopped abruptly when he reached his bedroom, eyeing all the pictures on the wall. There was a brief swirling in his head, like when you awaken from a dream and it takes you a moment to remember who and where you are. Stupid man, Roman hit himself in the forehead. He had been so distracted by love that he forgot all about his mission. Lucene. There were pictures of her and others tacked up all over the walls. He'd followed her from New York to Florida. Yes, his research for Tara was important, but Lucene's safety was supposed to be his primary concern. What's more, is that he was almost fooled by this Tanager. Almost. Why hadn't he realized it sooner? He's got to be working for them. He slipped the lapel camera from his shirt, pulled a portable computer out from the bedroom dresser drawer, and set it on the carpet. Plugging it in, he then retrieved photos, mostly of Tanager and Lucene dancing, but also of the entire evening. The camera had been set to auto-capture regularly. From another drawer, he drew out a mini printer, hooking the cable to the computer and laying them side by side on the floor. After he'd printed what he felt were the most revealing photos, he searched for pins or sticky putty to put them on the wall. Where did he put them? He searched the bathroom, catching a glimpse of himself in the mirror. He paused. It was almost as if he were looking at a stranger. He didn't recognize himself. Roman opened a drawer and found it filled with prescription bottles. I see what's happening here. He looked up and told his reflection. The royals know I'm here, and they're trying to torture me too.